All right, welcome everyone to this month's Eden Professional Development webinar. I'm Monty Dozier and I serve as the Program Director for the Disaster Assessment and Recovery Unit here at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I also serve currently as the Chair of the Extension Disaster Education Network and will serve as the moderator today. Please take a moment to drop your name and institution in the chat box so we can know who's with us today and help us with attendance and keeping up with our records. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Sonja Swiger. She is an extension specialist in entomology here at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. She focuses on livestock type entomology type questions. And then we may hear from Miquela Smith. She is a program specialist in our unit here at AgriLife Extension in health and mental health. She just texted me and she has a small family emergency. One of her children is sick at school, so she's going to pick him up. And if she can make it back in time, she will be presenting as well. And they are going to talk about animal and health risk associated with New World Screwworm and its potential threat to the United States. A little bit of housekeeping before we turn it over to Dr. Swiger is if you have any questions in the presentation, please type them into the chat box and we can ask those at the end of the presentation. There is an evaluation survey link in the chat box as well, and we'd ask you to take a moment to complete it at the conclusion of our webinar. And there is information as well because we will be recording today's seminar, and it is being recorded at this time, and that recording will be mailed out and also posted to Connect Extension under the Eden subgroup of the Extension Foundation, and then on the Eden YouTube page as well within the next couple of days. And there will be a link there as well if you want to follow up with an email about the recording in the evaluation email follow-up. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Swiger.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction as well as the invitation to come and present today. Let's see, try and get the correct screen up. Should do that. All right. All right. Hopefully you all can see my screen at this time.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, perfect. All right, so I am going to, as mentioned, talk about the New World Screwworm. And so just a little on my background, where I'm coming from on this, since I am an entomologist, I will focus on that side of this issue, most of it. And of course, and that all leads into the next part of it, which is the impact that we're concerned with to animals and humans as well, if it does return to Texas or anywhere in the United States. So first off, what is the overview of the screwworm is where I'll begin and go through a little bit of the history and then get into our management, treatment options and what's planned and what's currently happening in other countries. So the tools that we would use here would be similar, especially in some of our management situations as to what's already being done. So a lot of this stuff is already well understood, I guess is the way to put that. So what is the New World Screwworm? It is actually a blowfly. What's unique about this fly and the fact that it is a blowfly is that it has a preference for living tissue. What that means is that it only feeds on living tissue. So blowflies generally are a group of fly species that are large in size and metallic in color, and generally are associated with rotting materials. Most of the time, that's going to be a dead animal. That makes them actually one of our more beneficial insects in the world because they do lay their eggs on rotting material that the larvae then feed on, and again, thereby cleaning up that resource for us, which again is usually dead animals or some type of rotting garbage that may have some type of rotting meat in it or something of that sort. They do tend to prefer high protein food sources. Additionally, sometimes we see them in feces or manure of different animal species. But the New World Screwworm is very different in that it does not live in dead tissue. It only lives in living tissue. So these will actually be flies that will look for animals that are accessible to them, and they'll lay their eggs on those animals, and then those ensuing larvae or the maggots will then feed on that living tissue of that living animal. Their preferred hosts are warm-blooded animals. So they don't really have a preferred host if you look at it that way. They do have kind of what would I say, more host specifics that they choose, and we don't really know why they pick certain animals over others, but we think generally it's because of numbers of those animals. So the highest impacted at this time with the current outbreak are cattle, and they're also probably the highest in number of animals that they're obviously doing observations of in the countries I'll be talking about, especially Mexico. But other animals are at high risk as well, especially life or wildlife. And in Texas, for sure, because we have a lot of deer, and I'm sure some of you are in states that also have a lot of deer or even other animals. Now, there is a temperature variation with these flies, and I'll get into that in a few slides. So, if you're in some of the more northern states, your impact is less of a concern, but that doesn't mean it can't show up and be an issue in your state, if not temporarily. They will also attack pets, and as you will hopefully hear from Miss Miquela Smith later, is that they will is the impact we were worried about with humans, but they will attack humans as well, and I will show some case numbers on those going forward. So these infestations, which is infestations of larvae on a living animal, is referred to as myiasis. As you might imagine, this is not an enjoyable situation. It is actually very problematic and very painful to be fed upon by maggots. One of the main reasons why is because they do have what we call mouth hooks that they use to grasp and rasp at the food source, which again, if you're alive, you can feel that. And they also are generally covered in spines, so you can feel that too. The other big issue with this is that if these infestations are left untreated, it will actually lead to the death of those animals. Most animals do succumb to an infestation within 7 to 14 days. I'll kind of go more in specifics about how this happens, but a lot of it is going to be an infection that will come in after the infestation. But it can also be the infestation that does kill the animals. Now, generally, it can be more because, again, it's a festering wound, it's an untreated wound, it has bacteria in it, and that leads to the death of that animal. But sometimes it is the maggots feeding process that can kill that animal. And this fly is known as Cochlea hominivorax. That name actually means man-eater because they were found to be attacking humans way back in the day when they were really first kind of identified as a unique species, and their name was given in that capacity. So this fly has been gone for 50 years from the United States. That's important to remember that. We have had situations in the past, and I don't have all those in here in detail, but we do have times in the past when we've had them brought back to the United States, and generally those are identified very fast and very quickly, so they don't turn into anything severe. But we have not had them on, Texas soil for sure, but the United States, outside of one incident in over 50 years, which means a lot of the information we have about them comes from other states, countries, and time periods that many of us weren't around during. A lot of things we know about these flies is they're not heavily numbered. This is not a fly species that you will go outside and see just hanging out around a building or around animals or in large clusters, similar to flies that you may currently interact with animals. So if you do have cattle of your own or work with folks with cattle, they are always covered in flies. Those are generally going to always be there. Those are horn flies, and that's very common of those types of flies. But this New World Screwworm doesn't do things like that. They're usually hidden in the forests or vegetated areas in very low numbers, thankfully, because if they were in higher density, the impact would be much more severe. And they do have some limitations regarding temperature, which is coming in the next slide. So I won't get into that just yet. Another really unique feature about them is they do not have the ability to fly over large bodies of water, which is something we've used to regulate them and control them for many years. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with the Rio Grande, it is not a very large river and it's not a very large body of water. So they do have access at this time to potentially cross that water source because it doesn't serve as a barrier. So the map on the screen right now is an old map from 1962, and it did represent populations that were happening at that moment in the United States. This is a fly species native to North America. It does prefer tropical and subtropical temperatures, so it does stay kind of restricted on where we will see it without human intervention. But it does very well in those climatic zones for sure, which is, of course, most of southern Texas, as well as southern portions of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, or not Colorado, I'm sorry, California. I was looking at the map and called out the wrong state. And then sometimes, and then another concern would be Florida. So if they do get back to Florida, that's, of course, of major concern because the temperatures are very favorable there as well. Um, what else you'll see on this map is a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of stuff on this map, but what they're trying to show at this time period, it was after the eradication had occurred in the southeastern part of the US, which I'm going to go through in just a few minutes here. So that's why it's listed as an eradication zone. The dark black areas is where we would see continual accessibility of these flies during the warmer months, which goes up into the north central portions of Texas, as well as some other higher elevate areas in Arizona and parts of New Mexico. And then you've got below that, again, the natural range of them before they were removed. But you also have those hash marked areas, which are the seasonal spread. So it's listed as seasonal spread, but this isn't really spreading by the flies. This is movement due to animal movement. So flies, as I'll talk a little more about, obviously have wings and can move on their own, but they a lot of times are being moved by the movement of the animals infested over the movement of themselves by the fact that they just want to take flight. But their temperature range is, throughout what we would call temperate areas in a sense. If they do have accessibility back to those locations, they do like it around the 80s. They've got really great taste when it comes to temps. Anything from 60s, low 60s to early, low 90s is about where they want to be at. And, I mean, really, can we blame them, right? Those are good temps. But when you get into those more extremes, you start to see less productivity or less activity or no activity at all. So there are areas in the United States they cannot really survive outside of the larval stage. And again, this temp impact is more for the adult stage, but you'd still have to be concerned about their presence if they were brought there on animals in the larval stage. So this was put together for Central Texas temperatures. So just a reference point, some of you may not reach temperatures of this high and probably not at the same time period or for the lengthiest period of time as what you're seeing presented. And then some of you may stay in higher temps than what is presented here. But really what's the takeaway from here is more to think about when is your flies present in your area. That is when these flies will be present. So they're not going to act any differently than the majority of the flies you're dealing with on a regular basis because most of the fly activity we're seeing are musket or califorid based anyways. And those are going to be active through spring and summer, and again with variations based on where you are located. When we drop into those low below 50s into the 40s and less, there's no activity. That's again very normal for flies. They can't function that cold temperature. And if you're in an area where you have extreme high heat into the high 90s, into the hundreds, they don't like that either. Not saying they would instantly die, but they probably would start to have less of offspring and successive populations because that temperature is quite squelching for most insects anyways. It's just really hot and dry. So at least we do have some of that. But for the most part, the places they want to live are going to have the temperatures that they can survive at. Oh, and again, just to kind of reiterate that it was a lot on that one slide, but they were historically found in North America as well as Central America, Mexico included, of course, and then South America. They still live in South American countries, not all of them and not throughout every area, but in a lot of them. And they're also found still in the Caribbean islands, except for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, because we did eradicate them from those islands. They are only active in the daytime, which is a more of something of concern, especially when you're dealing with the human side of it. There has been talk about the usage of certain products that can prevent biting insects at night, but these are not active at night, so you'd have to use those products in the daytime in order to prevent to potentially keep them off of you. But that's something that we'll leave for later to talk about if we need to. But again, to think with your animal capacity, animals won't be impacted at night as well. So to get into the life cycle, this is a really well done little pictogram of that life cycle that I'll talk about first, and then I'll kind of break that down. The entire life cycle range is about 20 days, right? We have a 21 to 18 day time period that's from adult all the way back to, well, actually from egg all the way to adult. So the entire cycle included in there. If you again live in those off areas, it may take a little longer if you're in the cooler temps for this to happen, but 21 days is generally where we see that those temperature zones being, but down in the south, it's going to be faster than that. What will happen is once a female has mated and fed and ready to lay her eggs, she will go search for an animal with a wound, is how we refer to it as, but don't think of this of having to be a very grotesque situation prior to access to by the larva. It just needs to be a scrape, some type of a breakage in the skin that allows for those larvae to enter. Now you can have a very terrible wound that they may utilize, but a lot of times they're going for probably more obscure sites when they attack. Well, I'm going to break that down more, but I just wanted to get a little brief overview on that because I don't want you to get too hung up on thinking, oh, well, it's this and that. Those I don't need to worry about that, but they pretty much are just looking for any access point into the flesh of that animal. After those eggs are laid, they hatch within half a day. They then turn into larvae, which will feed through three different life stages, which are basically still all larvae or maggots. They just get bigger and bigger as they go. That lasts about a week, so 5 to 7 days, at which point they will leave the animal's body and they'll pupate on the ground. And it's important to realize that some of these life stages are very hard to find, very hard to identify. And the main target area is going to be the larva stage because that's going to be the feeding stage inside the body of that animal. That pupation stage is generally about a week, but it can be adjusted if those maggots did make it into a cooler temperature area. They can actually overwinter in some places in that pupal stage, so we can see a delayed pupa stage up to 54 days. So there are a few pictures in this because you can't talk about a parasitic fly that attacks animals without pictures. So just a little warning. I try not to keep too many in there, but you do need to realize the impact and what they are looking for. So this picture here shows, or this slide here talks about where those eggs are going to be laid. Part of the management system is to think of where they want to put those eggs so you can prevent them from wanting to put their eggs there. So again, they generally lay those eggs on the edges of a wound, and then they'll hatch fairly quickly after that. I said about half a day. Those eggs usually are in a clumped-like appearance. It almost looks shingle-like is how it's referred to, which is very unique for these blowflies over normal blowflies. And again, they're going to hatch out and be very small from that point on. And it's not impossible to see eggs, but not everybody is trained enough to find eggs or realize that that's what they're looking at if they're on a large animal. But sites of concern could be things that are part of the production system. So we're working with animal commodity groups. We definitely have to be concerned with the fact that they'll target any entry point, whether you've used ear tags, not insecticide tags, but tags for identification, whether you're doing castration, because that's just part of what we do, or if you have any type of cuts from shearing or any other processes or dehorning. These are all things we need to do or choose to do in those systems now, that we don't have to worry about them being attacked by larvae afterwards, but any of those would make an opening that would allow for them to get in, and it could thereby kill that animal. The biggest concern is the picture on the top, and it's in reference to the navels of newborns. Unfortunately, newborn animals are 100% susceptible without human intervention because these flies are really in tune to that, to the sense of those animals. They can pretty much identify when newborns have been born, and they will go and lay those eggs around those umbilical areas, and then those larvae will feed up inside that umbilicus. Other areas of concern are bite wounds left by other arthropods. So like ticks and horseflies and even cattle grubs can make entry points for them. Each fly female will lay about 200 to 300 eggs at a time. She can lay more than that in her lifetime, though. So that's just how many she can give off at once. She'll go and feed again and then come back and give more. So she can lay up to 1,000 or so in her lifetime. She probably won't hit the same animal twice, but some other fly may come in and hit the same animal. So one of the big issues we end up with is that while 200 and 300 eggs is a lot, and they're going to probably mostly hatch, probably 80 to 90% of them, you now have all those larvae feeding. But what's really happening is you have those larvae plus the eggs and larvae from another female. So this picture actually shows the second female coming in and laying those eggs around a wound. So we have to be more concerned about multiple infestations on a wound that's not being tended to in a timely manner, because it will bring in other maggots and, well, other flies to put maggots. What also can happen is we can get other species of blowflies that will lay their eggs, because while those other blowflies don't want living tissue, they want dead tissue. What happens when the New World screwworms are feeding, the larvae are feeding on the tissue, they're killing the tissue behind them. So they will actually produce dead tissue that will bring in other maggots as well. So if you're not familiar with blowfly maggots, hopefully these pictures will help you kind of think about what you've seen in the past or didn't realize was it. But if not, I mean, maggots kind of all look a lot alike. One easy way to tell most fly larvae from any other types of larvae is the way that they're shaped and the fact they have no legs, right? So they have a very unique features in that they're tapered at one end and that they're more of a while the back end where their posterior spiracles are, which kind of look like eyes down here on this picture on the left on the bottom, or up on the top upper one, those are how they breathe oxygen. It is kind of tapered again, but a blunt end, and it's not as fat on the ends as they are inside, but it's not the same approach as the tapering towards the mouth hooks. So these larvae will last again 5 to 7 days, staying packed tightly inside the host of their preference that they've chosen to feed upon. As you can see this picture of this deer, there's actually 4 puncture wounds packed full with maggots in there. And those are not super obvious if you're not having accessibility to these animals. So that's very important to realize that sometimes wounds can look like that and not be, again, very hugely grotesque. Now I will show you one that is, and it's extremely obvious, but this is one that is not extremely obvious. These larvae go through 3 life stages, which when they first hatch, they're extremely tiny, only 2 millimeters in size, and most are not trained to be able to identify maggots at that size or even realize they have maggots at that size, but they do start to grow fairly quickly. So these ones on the screen you're seeing are the full third instar, later part of the third instar stage, the biggest they can get. The one here on the bottom that's to the left of the deer is actually of a different species. So in comparison, there are differences between species, and there, we can see different features on them. In general, what we have to look at for this one is this is a Cochleomya macellaria, which is a cousin species, and it doesn't have those dark lines coming from the back end. So the one up here, these two up here on the top that have these really dark lines, almost look like someone took a marker and wrote on them. Those are the tracheal trunks, and those are used for identification of screwworms from others. But all screwworm identification needs to be done officially through USDA APHIS, and I'll talk more about that going forward. I kind of mentioned this, but I like to just show it again. There is some comparisons of the 2 species. Again, screwworm is the one on the left. The other ones are the other species that is not of concern. Most folks will not notice the larva until the 3rd day, which means they're already 3rd instars and probably starting to cause quite a bit of damage, if not a potential infection afterwards. They do go from 2 millimeters to 1.5 centimeters in size. And again, they must be submitted for observation or for evaluation and identification to the USDA National Veterinary Services Laboratory. How that's done through each of your states could be set up a little differently, but they are the ones that have to give the final identification for any potential screwworm maggots. And then if you may have some resources in your state that's set up to do that screening process prior to sending it to them. So this is the one slide. I'll try not to keep it up too long. Hopefully nobody's eating right this moment, but you might want to take a pause. I promise there won't be any more like this. But it is important to kind of comprehend the impact that this is going to have or can have on animals or is having on animals in other countries at this moment. And it's not just a livestock problem. So clearly these are 2 animals shown are dogs. The one on the top is severely infested and left without treatment. And it's to a point that animal had to be euthanized. There's no way to save that animal from that severe of an infestation. The one on the bottom is a savable situation in that it is just the leg, but if you're not taking the time to closely look at that, you may think it was just maybe some other type of a wound with nothing inside it, but because those maggots are really packed tightly in there. So again, these kind of situations can be fatal within a week or two. The biggest concern is of newborns, and these do give off a very unique scent. It's a very distinct odor, as I've been told, which will attract more animal or more females to it, but will also be a way of indicating that, hey, something's wrong with this animal, because you can smell something probably pretty grotesque occurring in that animal's on the animal's body. So treatment is a necessity. Treatment must happen. Larvae must be killed and removed from these animals. One, to ensure the health of that animal and ensure they survive. But secondly, to also make sure that the larvae do not survive, because we want to make sure we kill larvae and prevent them from turning into the next life stage, which is the pupa stage, which I have now up on the screen just so I didn't gross anybody out. Again, pupa are off host. They're almost impossible for most to find them in the wild. And one of the main reasons why is because they do leave the animal and they crawl into the ground and they burrow. So this is not a stage that we can actually target for management purposes. An infected animal is a non-contagious situation, so that is referred to as a foreign animal disease to have screwworms on an animal, but they can't technically infect others. So what that means is if you have one infested animal with maggots, the maggots will not leave that animal and go to another animal. They will stay on that animal completely, and if you remove them, they will either die or because you want to kill them, or they will pupate. They will not decide to access another animal to finish consuming food. They'll just basically force their way into the next life stage. So where that becomes really problematic is if you do not find the animal in time to properly dispose of a dead animal, because the screwworms, they are still providing enough resources to allow the next life stages, to allow that next population and generation of these screwworm flies. So if we find an animal and we treat that animal, we need to make sure we remove all those larvae and we kill every single one of them, and then make sure the animal is good to go back outside without any intentions of losing any larvae. If that animal does die, we still have to properly dispose of said animal's body, as well as all of the maggots on the body. Because if they've gotten far enough into the feeding process, they can still turn into the next life stage, which is the pupa stage, and therefore into adults, and then you still have populations. So the biggest issue so far has been the movement of these animals throughout the Central America and away and through the biological barrier, which is something we've had in place since the early 2000s. The majority of this movement, though, has not been because the flies have taken flight. It's been because animals have been moved through those locations. So as animals are getting moved or put on trucks and travel through different countries without proper treatment early on, it was allowing for infestations to develop in other areas. While this has kind of slowed a little with the animal movement in new infestation sites, we still have those occurring almost every week, unfortunately, and some fairly close to the Texas-US border. But flies can travel, obviously, on their own once they're in an area. They have been recorded to go 6 to 12 miles, but they only go that far if they feel the need to, meaning if there's hosts within a mile, I'm not going to fly 6 miles past the host I've already encountered. So they do stay close to home, which is very typical for them. I want to briefly do the history. I know I try not to take too much more time than I need to, but the one things that it's important to, again, to reiterate is that we did have them here, and then we went through the efforts to eradicate them. So they're naturally found in the states that were shown here in the red. They had never traveled across the Mississippi River prior to the 1930s, when we took cattle to Georgia from Texas and inadvertently traveled those screwworms over there too. Cattle were moved because of a drought. Unfortunately, Southeast is a very good location for these flies, and they did very well over there. That, of course, led to some mass destruction and concerns, and the producers in the Southeast reached out to USDA asking for assistance in controlling these flies, because they're devastation. That's only the best way to describe these larvae and these flies. So they came up with the sterile insect technique, which is where they rear these flies in mass numbers in the laboratory. Upon doing these mass rearings, one of the things they learned about them is that the females will only mate once in their lifetime, which is a unique feature for a blowfly for sure. But that allowed for this sterile processes to be a useful tool, because what you do is you sterilize the males, you rear them in large numbers, you sterilize them, you put them out into the wild, and then you hope that these females will no longer mate with wild males, but they'll mate with these sterile males and thereby not be able to produce offspring. So the sperm from those sterile males is not viable. The females don't know that. They take it all in at once and then they start producing eggs still, but those eggs never hatch. And this is an extremely successful tool, and this is how we eradicate them. So those efforts were taken on in the late 50s to 60s, and eradication was achieved in the southeastern United States. So if you live in those states, you may never heard about this fly until now because of a lot of this process. Then they moved it over to the Southwest, and in the 60s, they eradicated it out of the southwestern US, at which point we were declared screwworm free in the US. Unfortunately, in the 70s, because it was still in Mexico, there were outbreaks back in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma at times throughout the 70s. So it was decided at that time we needed to eradicate it further down, and they took it out of Mexico. So it took about 20 years, and they fully eradicated Mexico by 1991. Someone also had the thought to think, well, let's go further with this if we can and make it so it's not so hard to maintain. Because if we do not produce these flies and we do not release these sterile flies, they will eventually mate with wild type females and males and produce offspring, right? So they thought to take it to the Darien Gap in Panama, which is that red location shown in your lower map on the screen at this time. That has been a successful endeavor, and that was achieved by 2006, where everything past that Darien Gap was completely eradicated and had stayed eradicated up until literally 2022, with no issues whatsoever. Now, there was an outbreak in the Florida Keys in 2016 that did impact some of the deer that live on that island that was hit. This was a moved situation. An animal was brought to the island that was infested with those screwworms that led to the infestation of the deer on those islands. And because of a delay in reporting, it led to the death of 135 animals, which was 80% or more of that population, unfortunately. The current outbreak began in 2022. Panama started to see an increase in cases, which they were, of course, where these releases were occurring, and they were kind of like the gatekeeper, unfortunately, of keeping these screwworms from coming back from South America. Unfortunately, it did break down, and those flies had successfully moved all the way through all of the countries you see on the screen right now. By the end of 2024, in November, they arrived into Mexico, and this, of course, led to major concerns, more major concerns in the U.S. We were already concerned given what was happening. And this is what led to the border ports being shut to the movement of live animals, to protect against the arrival of these flies into the United States. Those ports are still closed as of today. Throughout the last year, so in 2025, we did have some issues that did cause a little more of a stir than others. One of which was a human traveler that made it to Maryland and it was identified with screwworm maggots on themselves, which ended up being in their head, but was nothing of major concern. It's just the fact that it did happen. We had 3 animals that were moved from southern Mexico up into Nuevo Leon, which is a state just south of Laredo of Texas. For those of you that are not familiar with Mexico geography or even Texas, it's just outside our borders. Most of these were over 100 or so miles from the border, but one did get really close at 70 miles, but all were resolved and all ended up being just maggots moved on an animal that had taken basically a ride on a truck, right? But in the day after Christmas, we did get our first incidences in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, which is located south of the southern tip of Texas. And that was a little more concerning because this was the first time we'd had any in any of the states that did butt up, that kind of butt up to South Texas. So as of today, though, this has increased quite significantly. We are seeing continual additions of cases. These numbers come out from May 6th. Now, they will update these numbers this afternoon or 5 p.m. today. If you want to check out the current caseloads, I will say we'll still be over 23,000 for sure, if not quite up into 24,000 cases. We have had over 171,000 accumulated throughout all of the countries that are now dealing with the screwworms, with almost 1,800 of those being human cases. So human cases do occur, but at a very low percentage. It's roughly about 1% of all incidences that are reported. Most of these cases that are being reported are in domesticated or livestock animals. We're not having much information on wildlife. There's no one to really do the surveillance, unfortunately, to those animals. So probably by the time they are finding any of them dead, they're not knowing for 100% sure if those are screwworm related or not. What else you'll see on this map that's on the screen, which this is the map provided by USDA APHIS, is that they do have this green area, and this represents where the sterile flies are currently being released. Those flies have never stopped being produced. They are produced at 100 million per week from Panama, and now all of them come up here into northern Mexico, into southern Texas, to serve as a barrier to prevent any flies traveling over into the United States at this time. The closest cases for us are just about 90 miles south of our border at this moment. Those do again adjust, not necessarily daily, but quite frequently. So these are the numbers from Mexico side of it. Their numbers do tend to be a little bit higher than what you're going to see on our US numbers, but they're fairly close. And this is from last week on the 9th. So is that Friday? I think that was Friday. Or maybe on Saturday. I may have updated it. I don't remember. But you'll see the numbers are still about the same, so just over 1,700 active cases and just shy of 24,000 accumulated cases. What else is important to see on this is, again, location of where those cases are and the species of animals, which are 70% cattle out of all other species recorded. Their accumulated human cases are now up to 244. So again, they do still continue to get human cases in Mexico, but the top species are cattle, dogs, pigs, and then equine, which I can't confirm if they're just horses or other, but I think their majority of those are horses. So what do we do to control? We follow some really important pillars. One of the most important is surveillance. We can't control something we don't know exists, so we must find them as fast as we possibly can to get those control measures in basically working and in production and doing the jobs they're supposed to do. That includes movement controls to inspect animals more frequently and prevent the movement of infected animals, and then the releases of the sterile flies. This is all set forth by USDA APHIS. They do have what's called the Playbook 2.0. If you have an interest or feel this is something that could benefit you, please take the time to look into this further. They're still taking comments on these, but this will be mandated if this fly does return back anywhere in the United States. Now, Texas, we're a little bit more on high alert because of our proximity to it, but it's not just us in which that will be impacted and result in these type of management decisions. So you can see what they're planning to do. In addition to those things that they have planned, and some of which I'm going to talk through going forward here anyways, they're going to do what's listed probably more as a restriction zone, I think is the more appropriate way to talk about some of this. The location in the center, which is listed as the infested zone and in yellow in this diagram, represents the indicated area where they found an infection or an infestation, apologies, of an animal, and it only has to be one to cause this to go into action. And obviously more would definitely make this much more problematic. But that from around that first infestation, it'll be a 20-kilometer infested zone, which will require the observation of all animals, so surveillance of every animal they can get access to and find, as well as fly surveillance and movement requirements and restrictions that would be set temporarily to ensure that no infested animals are moved out of that area. The next 20 kilometers outside of that will then serve as more of a surveillance zone. There will be probably animal surveillance, not as restrictive as in the infested zone, but if you're attempting to move animals out of that area, they probably would be put under some type of a inspection prior just to confirm there's no active larva of any type or wounds on those animals prior to movement. And then, of course, all this would be backed with fly releases and treatments for the animals to prevent the expansion and the infestations getting worse. And then they also plan to do further fly surveillance even further out. Says up to 200 kilometers. That's again more for precautionary than anything else, and that's how they're planning it at this time. Those fly surveillances are done with the traps you see at the top. So these are a lure trap that is designed to bring those screwworms to it. It does not collect large numbers of flies, of screwworm flies, because you can see there's flies on that picture. If you find one screwworm, it's one too many. So that's the threshold with these traps is one single screwworm. Again, that's because of their low numbers. And they're a little tricky to grab into traps at this moment. So this is the best tool we have for them. It's just they're still choosing to probably not venture to the traps over the animals. But again, we find one, we put everything into action if we weren't already into action in that area. You will get other flies on that trap though. Eradication is our only goal. And to achieve that, we must report it. And again, it doesn't matter where this ends up at, it must be reported, flies must be released, and so does treatment and all of these things that I just mentioned will go into action. And we want to check our animals we have access to more frequently than normal and as frequently as possible because that's to protect other animals in addition to the ones that we currently have the ability to check. We will also monitor for larva, which is animal examinations and inspections. Then they've already talked in here in Texas, there would be movement restrictions and limitations, and I mentioned that briefly. The biggest thing of all this is the sterile insect techniques and the releases of those flies. If you have not heard about how these are done, they are reared in a laboratory in Panama. This is the only functioning facility at this time and has been since the 2000s. They produce 100 million flies for release every week. Those are released multiple times a day throughout the week, every day of the week, I believe. So 42 release times, so a lot. And then those are grown on an artificial diet, which is a chicken byproduct, I believe. I get asked about that a lot. It's still meat because that's the only way that they feed, but they do have it pretty much down to a science in a sense. And then they radiate those pupa with cobalt 90 to disrupt chromosomes so they don't produce offspring. Additionally, I'm going to do time check. I need to finish up. Well, those are released here through pupal chambers or through the airplanes. The airplane is how they mostly do these releases nowadays, the aerial releases where they literally just sprinkle them on the ground after chilling those flies down and loading them onto the airplanes. For management considerations, obviously a lot of this goes back to protecting your animals. I think it's important to realize that wound management is where you want to start. To begin that, you have to do animal inspections. So you are inspecting for maggots, but if you find a wound, you treat that wound first to prevent maggots from coming into the wound. So it's really just kind of upping our game in some of our veterinary practices that may or may not be something that we've been too concerned with. Additionally, we want to up our protection from other ectoparasites so that we can prevent bites from leaving wounds that these larvae could potentially access through. There are products on the market that can be made usable for these. The ones shown here are fly sprays that are labeled for screwworm larvae. In particular, if you were to encounter larvae on a body, you would want to collect larvae first. You are mandated and must do that. You collect those larvae, you contact your resources of assistance and get those collected and sent in. What would be your veterinarian and your animal health group or your human health group if it's on a human. And then those sprays shown here can be used to kill the maggots because the maggots have to die, which is an unfortunate thing to say, but it is the truth. So there are several products that have been given conditional approval for usage against screwworms. The top three are only for cattle at this time. So we would You could only use them if you do have cattle to put them on, and they do have restrictions and limitations. These are not accessible at this time for usage because you do not technically have screwworms at this moment, so that does have to wait until that point. The last, and that's the Dectomax, the Exalt cattle, and ivermectin. The choice of some of these products, they're the one Dectomax and ivermectin are injectable. The Exalt is a topical solution. They do have withdrawal stipulations because all these products do. And ivermectin is only labeled for prevention and not treatment of infestations of screwworms. And then there is an F10 antiseptic wound spray as well as a barrier ointment that have been given approval for usage to other species of animals, which is great. A lot of others are listed on here, but it does exclude pigs, cats, and dogs. So you do, but it does have exotics and that are in captivity and zoo animals on it. There are some products for dogs, Credelio Quattro and Credelio Cat, as well as NexGard Combo have been given approval for screwworms. So those can be used for other parasites and now have the additive for that. If you see anything or suspect anything on animals, please report to your agency. This is just Texas Animal Health Commission for us. We do have them as our lead agency here, plus Texas Parks and Wildlife. Contact your veterinarian, and then again, AgriLife here is in line to assist with anything that may be encountered, and that may be true of your county extension agents as well. Report wildlife. This again is just our thing to show what we have set up here. But we want people to reach out and report anything suspicious because wildlife are a lot harder to manage. And with that, I hope I didn't go too long, and I will stop. So, and this is my contact information if you need to get a hold of me.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Swiger. So we got time for a few questions. Uh, do we have any questions from the audience? If you would state your name and then ask the question, we'll kind of move in that order. You'll have to unmute your mic to ask your question.
Can I ask, you said there's only one facility in Panama. Is that a Panamanian facility or is it a US facility? Like, who has access to the sterile flies?
It's kind of both. So the USDA is in partnership. I don't know the official split between those, but it is a USDA run in some capacity facility, and then it also is run by the Panamanians. So all of this started in the United States, all these eradication efforts, and when we slowly eradicated it out of our country, we of course moved those facilities down and into more appropriate locations. So it is still co-owned in some capacity. I just don't know that breakdown officially. I do know that USDA personnel do work through that facility, as well as the people from what is called COPEG, but as well as the Panamanians. But we own the flies, I guess, is one way to look at that. So that's why those flies are now all being released up into South Texas and northern Mexico, because USDA APHIS dictates where they're going to release those flies at, even though they're being all produced in Panama. And for time, I didn't put in there, but we do have two new facilities in production or in construction right now. One in Mexico that should be ready hopefully this summer, and then one in the United States in Edinburgh, Texas, that will be open by the end of 2027, as long as everything goes well.
And Edinburgh, Texas is right on the border, correct, Doc?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Any other questions?
Well, just maybe a comment more than anything else. This is Connie Burnham, and I'm part of the PD committee for Eden, and I appreciate you coming and presenting. When we were trying to find some webinars that might be of interest, the one thing that Dr. Dozier mentioned was that this is not only for cattle, animals, anything like that, but it also, because humans are animals, that it can affect anything that has skin. That was pretty intriguing to me. So
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, and I don't know if there's any cases in the lower part, of the United States, but are there times that this has affected the population, maybe in Mexico or some of the other areas like that?
So population of humans?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so far with this current outbreak, they've had almost 1,800 human infestations. So they
Wow.
are occurring. I don't know 100% specifics on any of those. In
Mhm.
Mexico, they're now up to just shy of 300 infested humans with this. Now,
Mhm.
access and location have something to do with that. Not everybody lives in an area where screwworms are present. But if you do have wounds that are not being properly treated, they will lay their eggs on them. So, we've had incidences in the US where people have traveled prior to this, and generally they had a wound on their head or on their face, but we've also had them lay eggs in noses and in ears. So it's not normal, but it can happen.
Mhm.
So yeah.
And I guess that was the whole point, is making sure that people understood that it does affect anything,
Yeah.
So but anyway, so I assume that there's treatment for that, and that
So probably now I will have to admit I'm not entirely sure what would be done on the human side. That does change
Mhm.
things quite significantly, especially because that does require doctor intervention. And
Mhm.
they haven't really said so much here in the US what would be planned, but it would basically be maggot removal, and then I'm sure they would give some type of a product afterwards to help with
Mhm. Sure.
wound healing and things of that capacity. I don't
Right,
know if
right.
Mexico is using at this time though.
Mhm. All right, just be aware, if anybody's
Yeah.
traveling or whatever,
Yeah.
and something like that happens,
Yeah,
that
travelers are
Mhm.
concerning now. If it did return, our biggest concern would be the unhoused population because they would
Mhm.
probably be the highest. Or if there are communities where living conditions may not be at the same standards,
Mhm.
because
Sure.
having open access windows and doors where you allow insects the ability to come indoors would be problematic. So
Well, thank you. I
you're
think
welcome.
that is important for all of us to know.
Yes,
Thank you for sharing your great knowledge today with all of us.
thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
And Miquela didn't get on, right, Money?
She was not able to get
Okay.
on, no.
What I will add is that if you do have a human incidence of any kind, they need to see a clinician of some sort. So in Texas, for sure, they need to go through a clinician to get those maggots collected. It's not something we want, people who aren't technically in the medical field doing. And then you can also submit samples, which I wouldn't say you, but samples can be submitted to CDC if you don't want to go through your state. But I know in Texas we want it to go through our Department of State Health Services. So
Exactly right. We got track
yes,
infestations as
yeah,
well on the human side. So, and the thing to talk about too is I would assume veterinarians would be working that same way. We'd want to get those pets to a veterinarian so they can collect those maggots
yes,
as well.
yes. And pets, at least in Texas, go through Texas Animal Health Commission from the vet. So again, each state may be set up a little differently on who that routes through, but the vet is always a great place to start. So, because most
All
time the
right.
animals need treatment too. So not just maggot removal, they need actual care to clean up the wounds. So.
Very good. Exactly right. Any other questions? All righty. Well, we certainly appreciate everybody joining today. I think as you look in the comment section, lots of people have said this is a great information. I agree with them. I appreciate Dr. Swigger and her knowledge and her skill in delivering that information to us. Thank you so much. And I'll remind y'all that we will send out an email about the recording. So if you have folks that were unable to join live, well, you can send them that information about the recording. And we also would like for you to take time to fill out the evaluation. We use that to plan um, future webinars and also to evaluate the quality of the information that we're sharing through the Eden web and our professional development committee. So again, thanks everybody. Hope y'all have a great day and appreciate all that you do for the folks of the nation.